Um, a very warm welcome to this session on art, scripture and contemporary issues, in which curators for the visual commentary on scripture are speaking about their experience of curating VCS exhibitions. And this is intended to assist us in understanding more deeply the value and potential uses to which those exhibitions can be put by churches. I'm Jonathan Evans, Associate Vicar for Heartedge at St Martin in the Fields, and this session is part of Living God's Future Now, the online festival of theology, ideas and practice from Heartedge. We'll be saying a bit more about Heartedge at the end of the session, and my colleague Ben Sheridan will be posting information in the chat as we go along. We would please to make use of the chat yourself during this session, and in particular please do post any questions or comments that you have in the chat as soon as you have them. We'll be picking those up later in the session for discussion with Susanna Snyder. And feel free to use the chat to discuss and to share among yourselves. Please also remain on mute unless you're invited to speak, as this minimizes background noise for others and would affect the quality of the recording that we're making too. So having said those things by way of notices, it simply remains for me to give a very warm welcome to Susanna Snyder, who will be speaking to us about her experience of curating an exhibition on chapters 3 and 4 from the book of Ruth. And we'll be exploring why she made the choices and decisions that she did in relation to text and images. The brevity of the book of Ruth belies its significance, and it actually offers an answer to some of the most important questions that the people of Israel grapple with throughout the Old Testament. So we're going to be exploring today questions such as how are we to respond to refugees, and how should we understand and inhabit boundaries. Susanna is lecturer in ethics and theology at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and an associate at the Centre for Theology and Modern European Thought at the University of Oxford. We're really pleased to have her with us today and to hear all that she's about to share. So thank you for being here, Susanna. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you for this invitation to be part of this series. I'm just going to try and share my screen. I really enjoyed putting my exhibition together for the VCS, and what I want to do in the next half an hour or so is just give you a sense of why I chose the biblical passages and works of art I did, as well as how I found them to speak to each other and to one of the most pressing contemporary issues of our day, forced migration. I know that some of you here will have heard Caleb Froelich talk about refugees in relation to his exhibition on Cities of Sanctuary a few weeks ago. And for those of you who did attend that, I'll be really interested to hear of any resonances between our exhibitions and what we've said when we come to questions and conversation later. Well, my exhibition is entitled New Life from Outside, and as Jonathan said, it's on Ruth chapters 3 and 4. It interweaves, as those of you who've seen it will know, interpretation of these chapters from Ruth with reflection on 3 artworks, and you can see the 3 artworks here. I'm going to say a lot more about those as we go on. And what I did in the exhibition was try to tease out how these works of art illuminate and are illuminated by the experience of forced migration, the experience of being refugees. So I guess the first question to start with is, well, why did I choose to explore Ruth 3 to 4? The choice had a lot to do with my background and the people and work I've been involved with for the last 17 years. So it all started really when I was training for ordination in Birmingham back in 2004. And it was then that I started to get involved in accompanying, in befriending people seeking asylum. I volunteered with an organisation called Restore, who was working with refugees, asylum seekers in the city. And I also got involved with a few other different church projects that were wanting and seeking to support newly arrived refugees in the city. So they were offering everything from warm meals and conversation through to English language classes. As a result of these experiences back then, I actually decided to start a PhD exploring churches' responses to people seeking asylum, because I wanted to understand more about what churches were doing and why they were doing it, and to do some reflection on how people of faith might be able to support people seeking sanctuary a little bit better than we were. And one element of this whole research project ended up being an exploration of the book of Ruth, as well as an exploration of the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the story of the Syrophoenician woman. So I ended up doing quite a lot of biblical reflection as part of my doctoral work. And I was exploring what these biblical texts might have to say to us today about how Christians should engage with migrants, and specifically with refugees and people seeking sanctuary. And in different ways and in different places, I've lived in various parts of the UK, but also in various parts of the US since. I've been involved in standing in solidarity with refugees since then. Ruth, I discovered, or at least came to see when, or believe when I was doing my doctoral work, is short, but I think it's one of the most important books in the Hebrew Bible. It offers an answer to some of the most important questions that the people of Israel grapple with throughout the Old Testament. And these are questions like, how are we to respond to outsiders? How should we understand and inhabit boundaries? Are we allowed to transgress them? Commentators disagree and dispute kind of when the book of Ruth was written, but whenever it was written, it's quite clear they do agree that the book of Ruth was written at a time that felt pretty precarious to the people of Israel. They were living in vulnerability, they were vulnerable to political pressures and powers, and were also working out their own identity. Some people suggest it was authored before their experience of Israel exile in the 6th century. And at that point, they were feeling pretty precarious because of threats to the Davidic monarchy. If the book of Ruth was actually written post-exile, as some other people argue, it was pretty precarious then too, because people were trying to come to terms at that point with the profound trauma of exile. The people of Israel, or at least many of them, and many of their key figures, had been forcibly displaced. So Ruth is written at a time when people, whoever's writing it and whenever they're writing it, the people of Israel, the people of God, are grappling with who they are in relationship to others and in relationship to perceived threats from outside, and also sometimes within. And the kinds of uncertainty and fear they were experiencing tend to provoke concern about identity and material resources. And so what we find rumbling on behind Ruth is an ongoing debate about how the people of God are going to respond to those who are other, those who aren't them, those who are outside. They're asking, who was to be included and given access to the holy places? Who was to be given rights to land, wealth, and power? Who should be excluded? How tightly should we draw boundaries between us, the Israelites, the people of God, and them, the others, the foreigners? Can we intermarry with outsiders, or will they pollute and threaten us? And it seemed to me, as I delved into this text, that the questions that are asked around migrants and refugees today are not so different. Who should be allowed in and who should be kept out? What rights and responsibilities should they have? And so I think Ruth can be a really helpful text to delve into as we consider today approaches to anyone who's seen as or labelled as other or foreigner or outsider. So when Ben Quash, the director of the VCS, approached me a couple of years ago and let me know that Ruth chapters 3 to 4 was available to write on, I leapt at the chance. I'd also at that point just been doing some reflecting on how the arts could be helpful in encouraging more people to get involved in supporting those seeking sanctuary. And so the invitation to write on these chapters presented a really exciting opportunity to spend some time reflecting more deeply on the intersections between Ruth, art, and migration in ways that I hoped would also be helpful for other people. Well, if that's something about why Ruth and why I decided to connect my exploration with the experiences of refugees and responses to refugees, how did I come to choose the 3 works of art that I did? Well, I'll say more about each specifically in turn in a moment, and I could have chosen all sorts of pieces, not least depictions of Ruth herself. And a number of images or artworks depict Ruth, and I could have, for example, chosen one of these. The one in the middle is by Marc Chagall, for example. Ruth is often in many of the images, if you just Google images of Ruth, you'll see a lot of these. She's often shown as being white. She's often gleaning in the fields in what seems to be an idyllic pastoral scene, or she's presented as having a kind of a beautiful romantic tryst with Boaz. But all of these kinds of images seem to me to gloss over who Ruth is and what she had to deal with. And they seem to gloss over, it seems to me, some of the deeper, richer and more challenging themes that the book explores. Or at least they only show one snapshot of a complex story. So I decided to choose works of art that got more at the key questions that I think the Book of Ruth invites us to grapple with. The questions I've already highlighted around boundaries, community, who's inside, who's outside, and so on. And the 3 artists I chose, Mona Hatoum, Gula Artes, and El Salahi, wrestle with these questions, it seems to me, in the contemporary context. As I started exploring works of art, there was one overarching guide for me, and that was that each artist needed to have experience of migration themselves. If the artworks were going to help illuminate contemporary refugee experiences and were going to be able to pose helpful interpretive questions to the biblical text of Ruth, which is all about the experiences, role, and gifts of a migrant woman, it seemed to me that this criteria of the artist understanding migration from the inside was crucially important. The artist needed to know deeply, personally, what it meant to be an outsider, a newcomer, not just be imagining or reflecting on it in the abstract or as something that happens to someone else. So that was my kind of main guide. So now let's turn to have a look at the 3 works of art I chose. Here's the first one. It's called Impenetrable, and it's by Mona Hatoum, and it's in the Guggenheim in New York City. It's made from steel and nylon monofilament, and she created it in 2009. Well, Mona Hatoum was born in Beirut to Christian Palestinian parents, and she's lived in London now since 1975. Her work often emerges from her own experience of exile, and it grapples with ambiguity and paradox. And when I first came across it, Impenetrable made me think about all sorts of structures that seek to confine and deter, to enclose and repulse at the same time, structures such as fences, camps, and detention centres. Impenetrable really confuses me, actually, and that's why I was really intrigued by it. The cube formed by suspending barbed wire rods from the ceiling seems simultaneously fragile and intimidating. The thinness of the wires and all that air, the space between them, invites me, it makes me want to enter it. I want to kind of get inside it. But somehow their spiky danger also makes this impossible. I look on, I look at it, stuck, sort of wanting to enter, but scared and unable to do so. And this, it seemed to me, has so much resonance with the experience of refugees and of the approaches that Western nations have taken to migration in recent years. If we talk often about the 20th century as one of growing global connectivity, it's the century of globalization. The 21st century so far has been defined by the reassertion of national borders and identities, particularly in the global north. We've seen it all over the place in growing movements of populism. Barbed wire fences, walls, and migrant camps have been constructed within and at the edges of Europe and North America. And all of these walls and borders and camps have been designed to contain people. Okay, so to keep them in, a bit like this cube, but they've also been designed to deter other would-be migrants from making the journey, so to stop them wanting to enter into the spaces. And here are just a couple of images of borders and fences and of the enforcement of these borders from just after the so-called refugee crisis hit the headlines in 2015. In the wake of the body of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi being found dead on a beach and being splashed across headlines across the world. I wonder if anyone knows what this image shows. Well, it shows Napier Barracks in Folkestone in Kent, which is currently housing people seeking asylum. Note the barbed wire fences, the walls, the containment. Conditions there have been described as inhumane, squalid, and unsafe. And a COVID outbreak recently affected 120 people. People who've been held there described depression, and there were disturbances at the barracks in response to the terrible conditions. There have been 7 suicide attempts and 7 incidents of serious harm. So one recent or one current contemporary example of this enclosure, this containment and this deterrence. And interestingly, the government's new plan for immigration that they're planning to enact in the coming months aims to build or have offshore detention centres to process applicants and to return people to other countries more quickly. So if we think that borders and fences and stuff are things that have happened in the past, they're not. They're currently and still being erected and put up to deter migrants. Well, numerous commentators now suggest that free market kind of cosmopolitan capitalism, optimism about the endless possibilities that could result from overcoming distance and difference has dissolved for many into this desire to restore an imagined boundaried national past. And you'll probably remember that a lot of this came up in discussions around Brexit. Some people felt that some of the conversations around Brexit were all about wanting to restore some kind of national identity. Others disagreed. Simultaneously, though, while we've got all this boundary and fences and the keeping out stuff going on, the promise of what lies beyond the boundary, safety, a move away from poverty, hope, continues to draw people to seek ways around them or over them. People, migrants, refugees still go to great efforts to get through these borders and boundaries. It's the kind of going into the spaces of Hatum's cube. The search for new life and to escape violence, death, and poverty means that despite the fierceness of the fences, the walls, and the policing, the possibility of getting over, under, or through and into the new country is enticing enough to get people to take the risks. But you may be wondering, how does all this connect with Ruth 3-4? Well, beginning with the departure from Judah to Moab by Naomi, Elimelech, and their 2 sons in chapter 1 of Ruth, the book of Ruth is imbued with borders and boundaries. They're woven throughout the narrative and they bifurcate the characters all the way through. When Ruth accompanies Naomi, she's become Naomi's daughter-in-law, she's been widowed, she comes back from Moab to Judah. Ruth crosses not just a geographical border from Moab to Judah, but also cultural and religious ones. And these borders are ones that she continues to negotiate in chapters 3 and 4, because she never escapes the label the Moabite. If you look at the book, it's really interesting. She's always labeled the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. She's always the outsider, the other, the foreigner. And in fact, she's kind of the ultimate outsider. She dwells on the wrong side of pretty much every religious, cultural, and social boundary you could imagine in Israel at the time. Moab was considered to be an arch enemy of Israel, as the Moabites had refused to help the people of Israel on their way to the promised land. And Moab was also born through an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. So Moab is really, it's not a good place to come from if you're in Israel. Ruth's also a woman, and she's a childless widow at a time when being barren was a sign of divine disfavor. Gender boundaries come to the fore again and again in Ruth chapters 3 and 4. So gendered roles, the societal roles, the economic roles, the legal roles come to the fore, and they're highlighted and challenged. Ruth's constantly negotiating these boundaries as she gleans wheat in the fields, for example, which was often very dangerous for women, and as she propositions Boaz on the threshing floor, something which risked her social death if Boaz had refused her. And like the barbed wire here of Hatum's cube, these national and gender boundaries in Ruth, the ones that she's constantly negotiating, have a power of resistance that's belied by their self-effacing delicacy. Ruth never escapes these boundaries, even when they're not mentioned explicitly. They are, like these wires here, unobtrusive, but they can be really dense and unpassable. So for me, bringing Hatum's impenetrable into conversation, into conjunction with the story of Ruth, shed new light for me on the perennial but hard to pin down, the slippery nature of borders and boundaries, and the effects that they have on the people who dwell among or on or over them. Even when migrants have crossed a national geographic border into a new country, borders continue to cross them. Borders continue to trip them up and confront them in sometimes hard to predict ways. And I think just wanted to share this quotation from Trin Minhar in her book Elsewhere Within Here, because I think she points out the persistence of these boundaries that for me is also caught by Hatum's cube. She writes, "Displacement takes on many faces and is our everyday dwelling. The travelling self is here both the self that moves physically from one place to another, and the self that embarks on an undetermined journeying practice, having constantly to negotiate between home and abroad, native and adopted culture, or more creatively speaking, between a here, a there, and elsewhere." Well, if that was the first work of art, the second work of art I chose was Isimsis by Gula Artes. I'd come to know Gula a little through the research project I'd taken on migration and the arts, and had loved a number of her other pieces. In particular, she'd worked with people who had experience of seeking asylum on a huge hanging made out of baby clothes that hung in the Salvation Army headquarters in London in response to the crisis of so many people turning up on southern European beaches in 2015. It was a part of a sort of a pilgrimage that was also set up in London as part of another art project. Gula lives and works in London, and she's originally from Turkey. And we had a number of conversations, and I remember part of one of these conversations being about how she'd learned as a child from her parents of divisions and distinctions between different groups and cultures in the area of Turkey that she grew up in. Isimsiz depicts a 21st century woman covered in brightly coloured lace and silk, climbing a staircase in Leighton House in Kensington, West London. Don't know how many of you have been to Leighton House, probably not very many over the past year or so, but in the 19th century, Frederick Lord Leighton collected a whole host of Middle Eastern artefacts to display in this Kensington home. And what Artes is doing here is juxtaposing Eastern and Western cultures. In her photograph, we can make out an Iznik hexagonal tile from around 1530 at the back there, and also a peacock in the foreground of the picture. And both of these reflect a kind of Victorian colonial notion of the exotic. Gula told me that veiled women drawn in Lord Leighton's sketchbook struck her as particularly exoticizing images. So there are a whole load of these women that he'd drawn on his travels and in reflection on these travels. And what she does here is she toys with these images. But the women here can't be pinned down. While her head and face, parts of the body often associated with subjectivity and identity, are missing, her upward movement indicates her self-possession, her power and determination to move towards an undetermined destination. Her mystery, I think, is not imposed then. The kind of dubious orientalizing mystery that projects a fantasized otherness, she's kind of reclaiming herself here. The woman refuses to allow others to fully see her and therefore objectify her. She keeps some of herself for herself and owns how she presents herself, in a sense. And this struck me when I saw this image as having really strong resonance with the character of Ruth. And as I sat with it and sat with Ruth, chapters 3 to 4, I think I was offered more insight into Ruth's complex texture, the complex texture of her character. Like the woman in Isimsiz, Ruth cannot be captured. Her portrayal is full of paradoxes, explaining why she's been so differently characterized by different biblical scholars. If you look at the commentaries, sometimes she's portrayed as the perfect, kind, and faithful friend to Naomi. So the Book of Ruth is a story then all about, or at least primarily about, female friendship and the value of friendship. But others have portrayed her as a kind of wily go-getter who uses her female wiles, her sexuality, to trick Boaz in the scene in Ruth 3, where she propositions Boaz on the threshing floor, that infamous phrase about uncovering Boaz's feet. Rather confusingly, as I've said, she's repeatedly defined as a Moabite, a foreigner from an enemy nation. But then, on the other hand, in the same book, in the same chapters, she's hailed as a worthy woman by Boaz and affirmed as being worth more than 7 sons to Naomi, and 7 was the number associated with perfection. So it gets quite confusing. Who is this Ruth? She seems to find her voice in chapter 3. She starts talking. She's barely spoken in the book. But then later, by the end of the book in chapter 4, she's returned to silence. She's effectively acquired by Boaz as his property, and has her child, Obed, her child with Boaz, taken away from her by Naomi. She's submissive and obeys orders, but she's also feisty and courageous, risking this social ostracism, being completely cast out and left destitute, to proposition Boaz on the threshing floor. So a bit like I'm left with when I ponder this picture here, this image, this photograph. We're constantly left with the question, who is Ruth? Does her character kowtow to patriarchal and colonial insistence that women's, particularly foreign women's, value is only to be found in marriage and bearing children for the nation? Is she what one commentator, Gail Yee, has called a model minority who's exploited for what she can bring to Israel? Or do we, in Ruth, glimpse subversive divine affirmation of her creative resilience, self-sufficiency, shrewdness, and love? Well, that's connecting this image with Ruth. Where's the third prong then? How does the experience of migration, the experience of being a refugee and people's perceptions of refugees interweave with these thoughts? Well, often migrants are pejoratively labelled in one way or another in the media and increasingly on social media, as if either people turning up in the UK are all the same, or as if they're all one-dimensional. Either they're portrayed as helpless women and children, people unable to help themselves and therefore potentially scrounging, people who only take from the country, or migrants, asylum seekers, are labelled as criminal, people who are deliberately scamming the immigration system to come and either get money through benefits or NHS healthcare, or that they're responsible for drugs and violent crime and terrorism. But I think, at least in my experience of getting to know refugees and people seeking sanctuary, they resist and seek to resist, just as the woman in his Simpsons does, just as Ruth does, these one-dimensional, simplistic characterizations of who they are and who they might be. And I think engaging with the biblical text alongside this image and my encounters with people seeking sanctuary today has really brought a richness to my understanding of all three. So I hope you can begin to see that there was something of an iterative process of engaging the text and the artworks and the contemporary kind of migration or refugee situation and the experiences of refugees themselves. The artworks have helped me, if you like, to inhabit scriptural texts in a more complex way, while the biblical story and characters and the stories of refugees and the experiences of refugees that I've come to know have helped me to find the words and questions with which I can interrogate and perhaps begin to get some insight into the artworks. The final artwork I chose was the Oxford Tree by Ibrahim El-Salahi. El-Salahi is a Muslim Sudanese refugee living in Oxford, whose work combines European forms and Sudanese themes. And I first saw some of his work at an exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where I live, and was immediately drawn to it. El-Salahi practices meditation, and the contemplative, meditative comes through his work strongly to me. I titled the whole of my exhibition Outsider as Source of New Life. And this was largely due to this work of art and what it helped me to draw out in new ways from Ruth chapter 4. Ruth, this Moabite widow outsider, is portrayed by the end of the book as a bringer of new life and as nourishment for the people of God. It's her actions and presence that are key to Israel's health and future. So in chapter 4 of the book, we see the son that Ruth has with Boaz, Obed, celebrated as a restorer of life and a nourisher of Naomi's old age. And then we get this genealogy of Obed from Ruth, listing Obed's son and grandson as Jesse and David, and sort of revealing, therefore, Obed's importance in the renewal and sustenance of Israel. Ruth is then the great-grandmother of the renowned King David, and through King David, for Christians, an ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. So Ruth becomes really pivotal in the whole story of the people of God. More immediately, kind of in the narrative, Ruth also bears smaller gifts to those around her. She offers Naomi, for example, 6 measures of barley given to her by Boaz. So we come to see Ruth, this completely outside, alien, not of the people kind of woman, as the life bringer, the hope bringer, and the God bearer. She nurtures and re-energizes, revivifies individuals, community, and the whole people of God. So how then does the Oxford tree echo or amplify or expound this theme? Well, trees are often imbued in religious and indigenous traditions with sacred meaning, frequently symbolizing life and growth. And they're one of a number of motifs in El Salahi's work that keep recurring. You see them again and again in his artworks. And one commentator on El Salahi's work says that he uses the abstracted motif of the tree as a metaphorical link between heaven and earth, creator and created. His work has variously been described as transnational, surrealism, and African or Arab modernism. And he's got a particular interest in the Haraz tree, which is depicted here in this picture, the Oxford tree. An acacia indigenous to Sudan that grows in the Nile Valley, El Salahi sees the Haraz tree as a symbol of the Sudanese and of their resilience. The Haraz is bare in rainy season when everything else is green, but it blooms during the dry season when everything else is stripped. And he says it's a very obstinate tree, just like the Sudanese. Finding the tree within as well as outside himself, El Salahi notices it trying to assert itself. So for me, when I looked at this painting, the tree spoke to me of Ruth's roles in asserting herself into and after her arrival in Israel. She blooms like the Haraz at a time when the community of Israel was struggling and dry. And fascinatingly, one possible Hebrew root of her name means to water to saturation. So Ruth transgresses boundaries to become this agent of transformation. Through having Obed as a son, she brings joy to Boaz and fills Naomi's emptiness. And she also encourages Boaz, and through him, the broader community of Israel, to enlarge their understanding of the Torah law concerning the role of, we don't need to go into the technicalities here, but of the kinsman redeemer and of the inclusion of outsiders. So really, Ruth, I began to see or deepen my understanding of just what new life Ruth brings to the community through this image of the Haraz tree, blooming when everything else is dry. Looping back to contemporary refugees and migrants, we only have to look at the pandemic to see one example of how much first, second, and third generation newcomers to the UK have brought to this country, as nurses and doctors, teachers, delivery drivers, scientists, other key workers, and so on. But more deeply than that, I'm encouraged to think of the times when my perspectives or understandings have shifted, subtly often, almost imperceptibly until after the event when I realised it. When my life has been enriched through encountering and building friendships with people seeking sanctuary. Finally, though, just as the individual works of art, the Book of Ruth, and contemporary migration can all be more richly understood by bringing them into conversation with one another, so for me are the textures and overtones made even richer by situating all three works of art, the text and the contemporary context, alongside each other. As I mentioned earlier, a debate ran through much of Israelite history as to how the community, the people of God, should relate to outsiders. Should they be welcomed, fully included, or perhaps just tolerated in some ways? Or should they be excluded because of their potential threat to the existing community's beliefs, way of life, and customs? Well, two trajectories of response solidified over time. One urged exclusivity. We glimpsed it in books like Ezra Nehemiah, where intermarriage is condemned and foreigners are prohibited from entering the temple. And this is an approach we definitely see today. It's the majority approach in the Western world to migrants, an approach embodied powerfully for me in Mona Hatoum's Impenetrable. I refer to this approach elsewhere as an ecology of fear. But there was another strand of response, if you like, which urged inclusivity rather than exclusivity. It encouraged care to be offered to the alien and hospitality to be showed to the stranger. And the Book of Ruth, for me, epitomizes this second strand. And it's what I begin to see in Asimsis and comes to fruition in The Oxford Tree by El Salahi. And I talk about this as the ecology of faith. And as I've sat with all of this, I think I've come to see that the borders so menacingly evoked in Hatoum's Impenetrable, those vertical barbed wires that exclude and harm those that seek to pass by, over, or through them, can turn into the life-giving vertical lines of El Salahi's The Oxford Tree through the story of Ruth. These lines in El Salahi, if you look at the picture carefully, they connect earth and heaven. They transgress boundaries between the mundane and holy to form this Haraz tree that's bursting with life. And just as El Salahi's tree fuses the vegetation and colours of Sudan with Western modernism, so Ruth is a liminal figure. Her hybridity and boundary crossing is what brings new life for Israel. She's like the woman in Asimsis. She resists being fully known by others, and her otherness, her courage, and her movement are what ends up being gift. Just a final word as I close on something that's missing for me, though, something that I don't think I managed to capture or was captured for me fully in these works of art. And I always think it's important, or at least honest, to say what's not captured as well as what has been captured. Something that's absent for me in all three works of art is human beings in their full subjectivity. We get a part of a woman, but not a full woman in Asimsis. But Ruth 3-4 is full of people. It's full of human beings. 55 out of 85 verses in Ruth are spoken conversation, which is the highest proportion of dialogue to narrative in any biblical book. And it seems to me that human relationship and conversation is really where this transgression of boundaries most takes place today in relation to migration. It's through human contact, through building relationships with one another, that we break down these boundaries and that outsiders become insiders, and those of us who might see ourselves as insiders come to recognize ourselves also as outsiders. God's presence in Ruth through the characters' presence to one another. So I think I want to say, if there's something that's perhaps not evoked by these artworks, but I'd be interested in your comments, it's that. It's the importance of human connection, community, and relationship building. And I think had I been able to, I might have added a fourth artwork that enabled some deeper exploration of that.
So we've got a little bit of time in which we can go to some of the comments and questions in the chat. I'm going to start with Claire, if I may, who's given us a quote about ways of reading books like the Book of Ruth. So I wonder, Claire, if you could just unmute and share your thought for Susanna's response.
Thank you very much, Susanna. That was amazing. And so sorry for spamming the comments. I think I put quite a few in there. But yeah, one of them was about how I've just been reading the very short introduction to the Hebrew Bible as literature and found it really fascinating. Not least because he writes about how terse the biblical narration is, which leaves so much room for character ambiguity and what they might be thinking. And he treats Ruth in particular. And also the story of Abraham and Isaac, for example, the sacrifice of Isaac. And so, yeah, what you were saying rang so true with that for me. Yeah, and just this, how we tend to put our own selves and ideas into biblical interpretation. So it's saying more about us really than what is actually necessarily in the mind of the writer as they were writing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm not a biblical scholar, and I should start by saying that I'm an ethicist and a practical theologian who dabbles in biblical interpretation. So I think absolutely, and often so many of the characters we have little flesh on the bones for are women, or those who were deemed other, of course. So I've learned a huge amount from post-colonial, feminist, womanist, Black African American women, biblical scholars, who've really encouraged me to delve into those characters that we don't hear a lot about. And I found it really valuable to read commentaries and to hear reflections on these texts, Ruth among them, but on other texts, from people who in their own lives, from commentators who've experienced othering, whether that's because of their race, their nationality, their gender, or so on. And those have given me whole different lenses on the text that I, with all sorts of categories of privilege I carry, just probably wouldn't have seen because of precisely what you're saying, because we cannot but read biblical texts from our own context and situatedness. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's who we are, and that's who God calls us to be in that moment. I think the invitation, the challenge is always to stretch our interpretation and not just to rely on our voice, our own voice, or the voice of those who are like me in whatever way it is. So thank you, really, really helpful, important points.
There is also the LGBTQ reading of Ruth, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's fascinating how she's been a character, or it's a book. And I was really interested in this when I was reading it for my doctoral work and more recently revisiting some for this commentary, how commentators really frame her story in a particular way. So some will really unpack it as her relationship with Naomi as a lesbian relationship. Others will talk about the book almost entirely as an example of divine friendship, a divinely blessed friendship, and so on. So the varied interpretations of Ruth are fascinating and probably all have something in them.
One of the other fascinating things that you drew out towards the end was narratives within the Old Testament that exemplify a response from fear, and narratives that exemplify a response from faith, and the contrast between the two. And as you were saying, we're in terms of the contemporary debate about refugees, that's essentially the place that we're in. So we've got a couple of comments in the chat that essentially relate to some of those narratives. So narratives around clashes between different religious groups, and stories in the papers about the amounts of money that refugees are having to pay to travel to the West. And so I just wonder whether you can say any more about the way in which the artworks and this text plays into that contemporary debate between these two different narratives.
Yes, I mean, I suppose we see in Ruth a lot of the boundaries, what comes out of, you know, and Ruth is negotiating these boundaries. It's not a story of unequivocal or wonderful, just Ruth is welcomed. And it's all, you know, as I say, she's returned to silence at the end of the book. She's constantly labeled a Moabite. So even though she's this kind of life bringer and God bearer and all the rest of it, there's still this ambiguity around her character in the text. So we see, if you like, if I've talked about the ecology of faith, which I think I mean more an ecology of trust or relationship building than of religious faith, if you like. So if we see that coming through strongly, we also see glimpses of you know, what I talked about as the ecology of fear. And I think we see that ecology of fear much more strongly in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, parts like Ezra and Nehemiah, where there are explicit comments about excluding foreigners from the temple and not intermarrying with those foreign women and so on. They're complex texts again. And I think today, what it reveals to me as I look at all of this together, I look at Mona Hatoum's reflection through that striking cube and those borders, is that these dynamics of fear and fear turning into hatred or othering are perennial. And I think, you know, if we look at the resentment or fears around migration today, they take loosely probably 3 different forms, although we could talk about this for a long time. But some of those fears or reasons for hostility are kind of sort of socioeconomic. They're about competing for resources and jobs and money and healthcare. The idea there's a kind of zero-sum game. If they come in and get jobs, if they come in and use the NHS, there won't be enough for us. So it's a kind of economic resources type fear. There are then kind of fears I think we see around cultural, national identity type fears. Oh, well, our food won't be the same anymore. You know, we won't have the same customs and cultures, and England won't look like England anymore. Those kinds of fears. What's our national identity going to be? What's it going to mean to be British if people from all over the world come? We're going to lose what it means to be British, I think, are some of the fears that we see. And then there's a third kind of group of fears that I often kind of talk about as politico-security fears. And I think those fears, they've always been there. They're to do with the stuff I was saying around outsiders of whatever type being perceived as criminals or as threatening to safety in some way. And I think those have really, really been heightened since 9/11 and in all the conversations around terrorism. And this equation that's often made, either implicitly or explicitly, between migrants and terrorism. So I think there are different contours and shapes of fear today, but I think some of those we glimpse in the biblical text when we begin to look into them too. So to some extent, they're perennial, even if different eras and times they have different kind of specific elements. Does that make any sense?
That's really helpful, Susanna. Thank you very much. I think we've probably got time for one more, which is more about art and church. So I'm going to go to Sarah Howard-Jones and your question about bringing artwork displays into church.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Susie. My question was, what might be brought to an artwork display that's in a church that's distinct from a display in a gallery? Mm-hmm. And I was kind of including also your example of the Salvation Army in the kind of church faith context as well.
Mm-hmm. thank you. Great question. I know Sarah a little bit, and I know she's been involved with St James Piccadilly, so I'm going to give it an example from there to kind of, I think, give a bit of an answer to that, or at least a step towards an answer. St James Piccadilly has had a number of art installations in their church over the past few years, and two in particular I was really interested and went to explore. One was a boat hanging from the ceiling of St James Piccadilly, strewn. It was a dinghy that had been rescued off the beaches of Lesbos, where the artist Arabella Dorman had spent some time volunteering, and she'd draped life jackets over it. She'd also draped life jackets over a nativity scene that was set up at the front of the church in the sanctuary. And this installation was in St James Piccadilly through Advent and over Christmas to Candlemas. What happened, Lucy Winkett, the rector, told me, was that she preached sermons, their worship took place underneath this boat. And actually, Lucy talked powerfully, and I talked to a number of members of the congregation as well, about how having this boat there in the context of worship, having it explored in preaching, but just praying underneath it, revivified, re-energized, made live again the texts, the story of Christmas and the nativity, with Jesus going into exile in Egypt with his parents. And it also enabled, sort of through making those connections, people to be sort of viscerally and powerfully moved about what was happening in terms of the refugee situation in Southern Europe, and of course moving in to other parts of Europe and Northern Europe at that point. So I think it's not just, I think having art installations like that in church, it's not just about, getting people to do more to help on a certain issue, whether that's supporting refugees or engaging more with the environment. But actually it's beginning to see that actually through doing that, people's journeys of faith and spiritual lives and understanding and relationship with God can grow and deepen as well. So it's a kind of mutually enriching thing, where relationship with God, the worship life of the congregation, and the church's engagement and individuals' engagement with some of the, with some people who are really vulnerable and some really important contemporary issues, are also enhanced and enriched. So I think it can be really beautiful in all sorts of ways.
Thank you so much for that, Susanna. And I think it would be true to say that what you've just been describing is essentially the experience that you've given us this afternoon in this session. It has been a really enriching presentation that's been thought-provoking for each one of us, and that has opened up new dimensions to these issues and to our ways of thinking. And it's been the dialogue that you've had with the artworks and the passage that has created the space for that. So thank you so much for all that you've shared. It's been wonderful. As we said at the beginning, this series is part of Living God's Future Now, the Heart Edge Online Festival of Theology, Ideas and Practice. And Ben has dropped into the chat details of other events that are coming up in the near future. You would be most welcome at any of those, starting at 4:30 on our Facebook stream with this week's sermon preparation workshop with Sam Wells and Sally Hitchener, if you wish to join us for that. But lots more and a huge variety of different events and workshops coming up in the very near future. Do stay in touch with us, and do join Heart Edge if you wish to get more actively involved with all that we're doing. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been tremendous to have you all here. Thank you for those who've shared their thoughts and comments and questions in the chat as well. But most of all, much thanks to Susanna for all that you shared today. We are very, very grateful. So thank you for being with us, and we'll hope to see you all again very soon. All the best. Bye.